So the world has seen significant improvements to gender equality and women's rights. Despite that, there are still many other challenges ahead. This year also marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a global agenda to push for gender equality and equal rights for all women and girls. Joining us right now from New York, we have UN Women's Research and Data Specialist Silke Staab. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So UN Women released its latest report on women's rights in review. So how has the world progressed in terms of women's rights and gender equality?
So what we show in the report is that really the world today is a much more equal place than it was in 1995 for women and girls. But at the same time, what worries us is that over the past 5 years in particular, we have seen progress slow down and we've seen stagnation in many areas. And we've also learned, I think, that even some of the hard-won gains are not necessarily guaranteed.
Right. And what do you think remains the biggest challenge to advancing women's rights around the world?
So first, let me say that there have been a number of important areas of progress. For example, today we have more girls in school than ever before. We've doubled the number of women in parliament since 1995. Governments have adopted hundreds of laws to level the playing field between women and men. So that really shows that progress is possible. But at the same time, we see this stagnation over the past 5 years. And just to give you one example, the world was very effective between 2000 and 2015 in reducing maternal mortality by about a third. But over the past years, we've really seen no further progress on that. And what that means is that almost 300,000 women are still dying completely preventable deaths every year. At the same time, we've also seen new challenges, right? So the last few years, the world has been rocked by multiple cascading crises. COVID was a turning point for progress for women and girls in many ways. We've seen a lot of regressions during those years that countries are now struggling to recover. We've seen a cost of living crisis. We're seeing spiraling levels of conflict. And we know that women and girls and other groups that are already disadvantaged often bear the brunt of these crises. In addition, I will say that what we found in this year's review is that 1 in 4 governments also report that backlash on gender equality, that is, deliberate attempts to reverse past gains, have hampered further progress over the past 5 years.
Right. And there are still a lot of challenges against women's rights and gender equality. But based on the report, there are a few challenges that you've noted, whether it's the negative gender stereotypes, how the laws and regulations, or that there are still cultural norms that still hold very outdated views about gender. And some of the countries have been leaning towards far right ideologies as well. So, from your perspective, which one do you think is holding women back the most?
I think one of the most worrying developments in these past 5 years is really the silent erosion of democratic institutions. In 2023, we've seen more than half of the countries in the world regress on democracy and only about a third making democratic gains. What this means in practice is that there is less civic space for feminist movements, for women's rights organizations that have been so critical to progress in the past. What that means is that we see increasing attacks on women in public office who stand up for gender equality and the rights of minority groups. So this is a very, very worrying phenomenon. Democracy and gender equality are two sides of the same coin. We cannot have democracy without 50% of the voices in our societies, and we cannot advance gender equality without democratic and responsive institutions.
In many countries, we have noticed that the female participation in politics is still very low. So from your research, why do you think that is the problem?
Women still face many barriers in public life, in politics, in the economy to advance and to make inroads. As I said, we've seen an important progress in this area, right? We've doubled the number of women in parliament since 1995. But at the same time, the barriers remain. The countries that have made the fastest progress are those that have taken deliberate measures to improve women's participation and women's representation, for example, by adopting gender quotas. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that it'll take at least another 40 years at the current pace of progress to have equal numbers of women and men in our parliaments globally.
So, from your perspective, how can we encourage more women to participate in politics without fear?
It is absolutely critical that we combat violence in public spaces and in politics against women. It's something that we've seen rising over the years and something that legitimately discourages many women from not only seeking public office, but also even making themselves heard, whether that's in public spaces, whether that's in digital spaces, right? We see deliberate attempts to silence women, to discourage them from making their voices heard. And so I think that is one of the most important barriers that needs to be urgently addressed.
You just mentioned online violence against women. And nowadays, people are much more focused on AI technology and new technological advancements. And a lot of this has been contributing to the spread of harmful stereotypes and online gender based violence. So, why do you think this is increasing nowadays?
We see an increase in, as you said, in image-based abuses, including deepfakes with the rise of AI. We see women targeted with hate speech, AI-facilitated hate speech, and misinformation. These are really serious concerns, as I said, aimed and having the effect of silencing women and pushing them out of digital public space. What is needed here really is an urgent effort to put in place better digital policies that regulate the use of AI and that hold social media platforms accountable for the online abuse that is perpetrated on their platforms. And those policies UN Women holds should be developed in a participatory way. Obviously, you need the government and the tech sector at the table, but it's always also very important to involve civil society, particularly kind of femtech activists and women's rights organizations who really have the deepest knowledge about how that abuse occurs and how to best prevent it.
And what has been the most difficult part in combating against the online gender based violence?
I think technology just makes it much more easy to spread abuse that we know has always been there, right? And I think one of the things that we also see is that there is kind of a continuum of violence between online violence and offline violence. So very often perpetrators offline use online and digital tools to further surveil their victims, stalk their victims, and put them under pressure.
Right. And your report actually listed the 6 priorities to achieve equal rights for women, and one of which is the digital revolution for women and girls. So, why do you think this has to be the top issue that needs to be addressed?
So we've already spoken, right, a little bit about the dark side of technology, but the truth is that digital technologies could be such a powerful tool for advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. They can provide access to information, to education, to economic opportunities. And in many ways, it's almost impossible today to fully participate in public life, in the economy, in politics without having access to digital tools. But at the same time, what we see is that women and girls still experience many barriers in these areas. And so that is why UN Women is calling for a digital revolution this year to really harness the full potential of technology. What that means in practice is three things. First, we need to make sure that all women and girls have access to and can use digital technologies. Second, we need to do much better in empowering women to lead technological developments and to be part of innovation. The tech sector is still a very male-dominated sector. And then finally, we need to make sure that digital spaces are safe spaces for all women and girls by combating online violence and harassment. I think what we would argue is that women don't live their lives in silos, right? The barriers in one area and the discriminations in one area reinforce the disadvantages that they experience in other areas. This is why the 6-point action plan that UN Women has developed is really comprehensive. It includes a focus on the digital revolution alongside continued efforts to really eliminate gender-based violence, promote women's participation in the workforce, empower women. And I think that is an increasingly important issue in climate action, where we see, a lot of effort will have to be in the coming years to make sure that women can really contribute to resilience building and the transformation of economies towards greening and sustainability.
Right. And how long do you think it will take for the world to fully achieve gender equality? And which region do you think would take the longest from your perspective?
So currently, unfortunately, we are very far off the mark. A girl who's born today will only see an equal number of women in parliament when she's 40. She'll be 68 by the time we eradicate child marriage, and she will never see the eradication of women's and girls' poverty in her lifetime because we're currently 137 years away from that. So this is obviously unacceptable. We need to do much better. We need to progress much faster in many of these areas. We know what works. We know how to get the job done. So UN Women is calling on world leaders this year to really turn their promises into action to achieve equality, rights, and empowerment for all women and girls.
Right. And is there a specific region that would take the longest to achieve gender equality?
What we see currently is that the contexts where it is hardest to make progress on gender equality and the rights of women and girls are countries and contexts that experience conflict. In the past years, we've seen an unprecedented number of conflicts and humanitarian crises. And what we know is that in these contexts, every indicator of gender equality, every indicator of women's well-being deteriorates. Girls are less likely to go to school, more likely to be married off as children. Women have less access to maternity care, are more likely to die in childbirth. Levels of sexual exploitation and violence often escalate. So without peace, it's going to be very hard to move the needle on some of those things.
Right. And for the Southeast Asian region, what would be your top recommendations for governments in these countries to improve women's rights and gender equality there?
So Southeast Asia has made a lot of progress on gender equality over the past years as well. One area that we see where the region is kind of lagging in terms of progress compared to other regions is women's representation in public office. We still see 3/4 of seats in parliament taken by men, for example. I think Vietnam is the only country in the region that has more than 30% of women in parliament. We see a very low number of women in cabinet posts. So I think that is an area that is really important. And I think alongside that, there are two areas that will really shape the kind of the progress that we can make on gender equality in the coming years, and that is climate action and digitalization. So I think in these two areas, it's really important to advance towards greater inclusion of women, but also more gender responsive policies to make sure that we tackle those two challenges and turn them into opportunities for advancing gender equality. I think without that, it'll be very difficult to make change in other areas, because what we need to do is make sure that women are represented, that women can shape digital policies, policies for the world of work. We know that when women are better represented in parliaments and politics, we see stronger responses on gender-based violence and other issues. I think an additional issue that we see will be critical to kind of unlock progress, particularly in the world of work, is to invest in the care economy and redistribute unpaid care and domestic work more equally between women and men. Southeast Asia is not a particular case in this regard. This is something that, again, we see all over the world. But an area without dedicated support and action, expansion of childcare services, greater investments in long-term care in a region in particular that is rapidly aging, right, will be really important to ensure that women can fully participate in the economies and societies of Southeast Asia.
All right, that is a great insight from UN Women as well. So thank you so much for today.
Thanks for having me.